Behind bars for life. The murder of Melissa Lamech. Matthew Ploy will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The court sentenced him to 60 years for premeditated murder and an additional 15 years for arson. In March, an Ogo County jury found Ploy guilty of murdering his girlfriend, Melissa Lamech, who was in the final stages of pregnancy. He strangled her and then set their home in Mount Morris on fire to cover up the crime. This sentence was a long-awaited act of justice for Melissa's family. For years, they have honored her memory through the Ice Hogs Teddy Bear Toss charity event, collecting toys for children. But nothing could dull the pain of their loss. 2 days before birth. Thanksgiving was just 2 days away. The Lamech family had everything ready: turkey, side dishes, and a cozy gathering of loved ones. But this time, they had an even more important reason to celebrate. 27-year-old Melissa, a paramedic by profession, was expecting her firstborn, Barrett. She had eagerly anticipated meeting her son, preparing the nursery, picking out tiny clothes, and dreaming of the moment she would hold him for the first time. But that day never came. A fire that revealed a dark truth. Everything changed on the evening of November 25, 2020. At 4 p.m., neighbors noticed thick black smoke billowing from a small home in Mount Morris. The fire alarm was blaring, but no one inside was responding. Within minutes, multiple fire crews arrived at the scene. Flames weren't visible from the street, but the smoke was engulfing the roof, filling the air with a choking haze. Pushing through the dense fog, firefighters entered the house. The living room, empty. The hallway, silent. Then, in the kitchen, they found a chilling scene. Lying motionless on the floor near the stove was a woman. It was Melissa Lamech, a young mother just 2 days away from giving birth. But something didn't add up. Her body wasn't burned, there were no signs of soot on her skin. She hadn't died from the fire. The flames were not the cause of her death. Something far more sinister had happened. Before we continue, I want to thank you, my amazing viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and comments make these stories more meaningful. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Now, let's uncover what really happened to Melissa Lamech.
Melissa Lamech wasn't just any 27-year-old. She was someone people noticed, someone with a fire inside her, the kind of person who refused to settle, refused to back down. Growing up, she had been a little shy, but that never stopped her from pushing herself. By the time she reached high school, she was unstoppable, fiercely independent, determined to make something of herself, always willing to stand her ground. She had bounced around between different community colleges, trying to figure out her future. But then, something clicked. One night, she had a medical emergency that landed her in an emergency room, and the way those paramedics treated her, it changed everything. She wanted to be that person. She wanted to be the one people trusted in their worst moments. That's how she ended up as an EMT, and not just any EMT, one who took her job seriously. She was the type to volunteer for the tough shifts, the long nights, the calls that no one else wanted. By the time 2020 rolled around, she had one more title to add to her name: Mom. Melissa wasn't expecting to become a single mother. The father of her baby, Matthew Ploy, had made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with the pregnancy. But she didn't let that stop her. She picked the name Barrett for her son and made sure everything was ready for his arrival. Her family stepped up too. Her mother, Deanna Lamech, reassured her, "You don't need him. You have us. Whatever you need, we'll help you." And Melissa believed that. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. But 2 days before she was supposed to hold her son for the first time, she was lying lifeless in her own home, smoke filling the air. At first glance, the fire didn't seem massive. It hadn't consumed the entire house. It hadn't burned through walls or collapsed the ceiling. It had stayed mostly in the kitchen. That alone raised red flags. Fires that break out naturally spread. They move from room to room, burning everything in their path. But this fire, it seemed contained. Something about it felt deliberate. As firefighters worked, investigators from the Illinois State Fire Marshal's office arrived on the scene. Their job? Figure out where the fire started and whether it was an accident or something else. It didn't take long to pinpoint the origin: a cabinet above the stove. That was strange. Kitchen fires usually start from the stove itself. A pan left unattended, a grease fire, maybe a burner left on too long. But here, the stove was off. The oven was off. No signs of a grease fire, no electrical issues, nothing. That left one possibility. Someone had started this fire on purpose. And then there was the biggest question of all. Melissa wasn't just anyone. She was a trained EMT. She had handled dozens of emergency situations, had been inside burning buildings before, had rescued other people from dangerous situations. And yet, when the fire started in her own home, she never made it out. She had 3 exits within 20 feet of her, a front door, a back door, a window that she could have escaped through. But she never moved. She never ran. She never tried to get out, which meant one thing. Something happened to her before that fire started. And now investigators had to figure out what. For Melissa's family, the nightmare began with a phone call. It was Carl, her brother. His voice was frantic, words rushing out faster than his mother, Deanna Lamesh, could process. "Have you heard from Melissa?" It was a strange question, but Deanna didn't think much of it at first. It was Thanksgiving Eve. Melissa had been busy preparing for the holiday, probably running errands or resting before her big hospital visit on Friday morning. Carl didn't even hesitate. "The neighbor called me. Gus's house is on fire." A sudden, crushing weight in Deanna's chest. The words barely made sense. Melissa was supposed to be home, waiting for her baby's arrival, not trapped in a burning house. But the more calls came in, the clearer it became. No one had heard from Melissa. No one had seen her. No one knew if she had gotten out. And that's when Deanna's world collapsed. Because in the span of minutes, the fire chief confirmed what no mother should ever have to hear. Her daughter was dead. And Barrett, Melissa's unborn baby, due in just 48 hours, was gone too. For the Lamish family, the next 24 hours were a blur of shock, confusion, and unbearable grief. Melissa's father, Gus Lamish, was out of town, completely unaware of what had happened. When he finally got the call, he refused to believe it. How could he? His daughter was young, healthy, and strong. She had been so excited about becoming a mother. This wasn't supposed to happen. Then came Thanksgiving dinner. The family gathered, but nothing felt real. Cassie, Melissa's sister, was still waiting for a text, a call, anything to tell her this was all a mistake. And then, as everyone took their seats at the table, someone noticed it. An extra plate had been set. For Melissa. No one had even realized they had done it. They had set a place for her, like she was still supposed to walk through the door, still supposed to sit down and laugh, still supposed to talk about how excited she was for Barrett's arrival. But she would never walk through that door again. And then on Friday morning, the morning Melissa was supposed to give birth, her mother had to make another call. She called the hospital, the one expecting Melissa for her induction. "Melissa won't be coming." The nurse on the other end paused, stunned, and that's when it hit Deanna all over again. Melissa hadn't just died. An entire life had been stolen. Her grandson would never take his first breath. He would never feel his mother's warmth. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a crime. And soon the autopsy report would prove it. In cases of house fires, death usually comes in one of 2 ways, burns or smoke inhalation. But when the pathologist examined Melissa's body, it didn't take long to realize that this wasn't a normal fire death. In fact, it wasn't a fire death at all. Melissa's lungs were clean, no soot, no smoke damage, nothing to indicate she had been breathing when the flames erupted. Her carbon monoxide levels were normal. That meant she hadn't suffocated. So what had happened? Then came the next finding. Her body told a different story, one that didn't begin with a fire. There were petechial hemorrhages, tiny ruptured blood vessels around her eyes and neck, deep bruises in the muscles of her throat, signs of a violent struggle, and the biggest clue of all, DNA under her fingernails. Melissa had fought back. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a medical episode. This was murder. And suddenly the fire made sense. Because someone had started it to cover their tracks. Someone had killed Melissa first, then set the fire to destroy the evidence. Now investigators had one question. Who was the last person to see Melissa alive? Investigators went straight to Melissa's family. They needed every detail, every conversation, every name. And that's when they learned something chilling. Melissa had been on the phone when she was interrupted. She had been talking to her sister, Cassie, just hours before she died. And then, in the middle of their conversation, she looked out the window and saw someone. Cassie still remembered the last thing Melissa ever said to her. "Matt's here again. He needs to stop doing this." And then, the call ended. Cassie had expected her sister to call her right back, but she never did. Now police had their first name, Matthew Plote, a firefighter, a paramedic, a man who had trained to save lives. But more importantly, the father of Melissa's unborn child, a man who had spent the last 9 months pretending her pregnancy didn't exist, a man who had told her to get rid of the baby, then ghosted her when she refused, a man who had shown up unannounced over and over again, even after Melissa told him to stop. And now, the day before Thanksgiving, he had been the last person to see her alive. Investigators dug in. They pulled phone records, surveillance footage, work schedules, and what they found was unsettling. Plote had called in sick on the day of the fire. He had no alibi. He had left his phone at home, a move that suggested he didn't want to be tracked. And when detectives brought him in for questioning, he admitted to being at Melissa's house that day. He admitted they talked about the baby, and he admitted he left before the fire started. But was that true? Because as the evidence piled up, it was becoming very clear. Melissa LeMesh never had a chance to escape that fire, because by the time it started, she was already gone. If there was one thing Matthew Plote had perfected in his 33 years of life, it was the art of hiding things. On the surface, he was a firefighter and paramedic, a man trained to save lives, not take them. The kind of guy who showed up to work on time, did his job without complaints, and kept his personal life completely separate from the people around him. But behind that carefully maintained image, there were secrets. Because for nearly a decade, Melissa LeMesh had been one of them. They had known each other for years. It wasn't love. It wasn't even a relationship. It was an on-again, off-again hookup, something that never amounted to anything serious, at least not to Matt. But then, April 2020 came, and suddenly there was a baby. Melissa was excited, terrified maybe, but excited. She knew it would be hard. She knew she'd be doing it alone, but she was ready to be a mom. Matt, on the other hand, was furious. From the moment she told him, he wanted no part of it. "You should get rid of the babai." That was his first reaction. He wasn't gentle about it. He wasn't asking. He was telling her what she needed to do. Melissa refused. She was having this baby, with or without him. And when Matt realized he couldn't control the situation, he disappeared. He stopped responding to her texts, stopped answering her calls, completely shut her out. And for months, Melissa didn't hear a word from him. But she wasn't about to let him pretend their baby didn't exist. So she did something he never saw coming. She went straight to his parents. She walked right up to their house, knocked on the door, and told them everything. "Hi, my name is Melissa. I'm having your son's baby. You're about to be grandparents." She told them the due date, showed them the sonogram pictures, made it clear that whether Matt wanted to be involved or not, this baby was real. And Matt, he lost it. When he found out what she had done, he was livid. Melissa told her family he was angry that she had forced the truth into the open. He had spent months keeping his double life under wraps, carefully maintaining his image at work, his reputation, his personal relationships, and now his parents knew. Now everything was unraveling, and that's when he started showing up, unannounced, uninvited. Melissa told her sister, Cassie, that he had started randomly appearing at her house. He needs to stop this. But he didn't stop. And 2 days before she was supposed to give birth, he knocked on her door one last time. By the time detectives brought Matthew Plote in for questioning, they already knew a lot. They knew he was the last person to see Melissa alive. They knew he had no alibi. They knew he had called in sick that day, meaning he had no reason not to be at that house. And when they sat across from him in the interrogation room, he didn't try to hide it. "Yeah, I was there." He admitted it right away, told them he had stopped by to talk about the baby, nothing unusual, and according to Matt, it was just a conversation. They talked about finances. He wanted to discuss visitation. He said he was warming up to the idea of being a father. And after that, He left. He walked out the door, saw her standing by the microwave, heating up some food. And that was the last time he ever saw her. That was his story. Clean, simple, nothing suspicious. But the problem was, it wasn't true. Because if Melissa had been alive and well when he left, then explain this. Why did she never respond to any more texts? Why didn't she call Cassie back like she said she would? Why did the autopsy show she had been dead before the fire even started? And most importantly, why did Matt leave his phone at home that day? Because that was something detectives had already confirmed. He hadn't just forgotten it. It wasn't a mistake. He had left it behind. And people don't do that unless they don't want to be tracked. At first, detectives let Matt talk. They wanted to see how he handled himself, see if he got nervous, if he tripped over his own words. But what they noticed was something even more disturbing. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't upset. He was emotionless, and he sat there, calm, expressionless, answering their questions like he was talking about the weather. And then one of the detectives asked the big question, "Did you plan this?" And for the first time, Matt hesitated. It was barely noticeable, a half-second pause, but it was enough. "I never wanted to hurt her," he said. "Not I didn't do it. Not you've got the wrong guy. Not this is crazy. I would never do something like that. Just, I never wanted to hurt her." The room went silent. The detective leaned in. "So it was an accident?" Another pause, and then, "Yes, that was it." That was the closest thing they were ever going to get to a confession. Because for the first time in that entire interview, Matthew Plote wasn't just answering questions, and he was admitting something. And the second that word left his mouth, detectives knew that they were looking at the man who killed Melissa Lameche. And the only thing left to do was prove it. Matthew Plote had already shown detectives that he was capable of keeping huge secrets, but they were about to find out just how far he had gone to maintain his double life. Because while Melissa was preparing to bring their child into the world, Plote was busy with someone else, a woman named Katie. Katie had been dating Plote for months, but what she didn't know, what she had never even suspected, was that he was about to become a father. She had no idea that just 2 days before his son was supposed to be born, Plote was standing in the home of the woman carrying his child. Detectives started digging deeper, piecing together the timeline of that night. Plote had been planning to end things with Katie, and not just in some distant future, on the very night of the murder. That detail changed everything. It meant that, in his mind, he wasn't just erasing Melissa. He was clearing the slate. He had spent months ignoring the pregnancy, avoiding responsibility, pretending it didn't exist. But then Melissa did something he couldn't control, and once the truth was out, he couldn't just walk away anymore. So what if, instead of walking away, he decided to eliminate the problem entirely? Melissa wasn't asking him for anything. She wasn't taking him to court. She wasn't demanding child support. She wasn't forcing him to be a father. She just wanted Barrett to have the chance to know his family. But for Plote, that wasn't good enough. He wanted Melissa gone, and if he did it right, he could make it look like an accident. But that's not all. Because once detectives had Katie's name, they started looking at his phone records, and what they found made one thing crystal clear. Plote had been leading a double life, and to keep it from falling apart, he had killed Melissa. The forensic evidence was already stacking up against him, but investigators weren't done yet. They needed more, and when they got a search warrant for Plote's home, they found exactly that. In his trash, they uncovered a few seemingly random items: a pair of rubber gloves, a pink BIC lighter, a Fitbit. Individually, they didn't seem like much, but put together, they painted a different picture. But here's where things get even worse for Plote. The pink BIC lighter in his trash was a perfect match for the kind of accelerant-based ignition used to start the fire. The rubber gloves indicated an attempt to cover his tracks. And then there was the Fitbit. Fitbits don't just track steps. They record heart rate, movement, timestamps. So investigators now had a potential timestamp of when Plote was physically active. They just needed to match it to the fire's timeline. It was becoming more obvious by the minute. Plote hadn't just killed Melissa. He had taken his time cleaning up after himself. He had planned this. And the deeper investigators went, the worse it got. By now, detectives had a pile of circumstantial and forensic evidence, but there was one more thing they wanted: Plote's own words. And that's where Chief Rob Schultz came in. Plote wasn't just a suspect, he was also a firefighter. And at the Carroll Stream Fire District, he had a boss, a man who had known him for years, had trusted him with life and death decisions, had believed he was someone dedicated to saving people, not hurting them. So when Chief Schultz was approached by investigators with an unusual request, he was stunned. They wanted him to wear a wire. They wanted him to sit down with Plote, man to man, firefighter to firefighter, and get him talking. At first, Schultz hesitated. This wasn't something a fire chief was trained to do. He put out fires. He didn't conduct interrogations. But then he thought about Melissa. He thought about her unborn child. And he thought about how, for nearly a year, Plote had continued walking around a free man. So he agreed. On the day of the operation, everything was set up perfectly. Schultz called Plote, told him to come in for a meeting. Nothing formal, nothing suspicious, just a casual conversation. And when Plote arrived, he had no idea the entire firehouse had been cleared out. He had no clue that, just outside the room, investigators were listening in. He just sat across from his boss, like he had done 100 times before, and started talking. Schultz didn't push too hard. He didn't accuse. Instead, he let Plote believe this was just a chat between colleagues. "I just want to understand what happened," Schultz said. "Tell me what you can." Plote didn't flinch. He didn't react. And that was the first red flag. Because an innocent man, he would have fought back. He would have said, "This is insane. I had nothing to do with this." But instead, Plote just sat there, listening, silent and unmoved. And never, not once, did he deny it. At the end of the meeting, Schultz didn't need to say much. "You can't come back to work." Plote just nodded. And with that, his time as a firefighter was over. But his time as a free man, that was running out too, because detectives were closing in. And the next time Plote sat down for a conversation, it wouldn't be with his fire chief. It would be with a judge. For 469 days, Matthew Plote walked free. He lived his life as if nothing had happened, working part-time, going about his routine, blending into the world like a man with no weight on his conscience. But detectives hadn't forgotten, and neither had Melissa's family. They waited and they pushed, and they refused to let her case go cold. And then, finally, on March 9th, 2022, their patience paid off. That morning, officers pulled up outside a small office building in Malta, Illinois, where Plote had been working part-time in an insurance agency. He had no idea what was coming. By the time he noticed the officers walking toward him, it was too late. "Matthew Plote, you're under arrest." They didn't need to explain why. He already knew. Plote was charged with first-degree murder, intentional homicide of an unborn child, aggravated battery, concealment of a homicidal death, and arson. Bail was set at $10 million, an amount that made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. But Plote never reacted. No outrage, no protests, no desperate claims of innocence. Just the same cold, expressionless stare. If there had ever been a single moment of remorse, no one ever saw it. By the time March 18th, 2024 arrived, it had been more than 3 years since Melissa and Barrett had lost their lives. 3 years of unanswered questions, of waiting, of wondering if justice would ever come. But now inside a courtroom in Ogle County, Illinois, 12 jurors were about to decide Matthew Plote's fate. The prosecution didn't waste time. They had a story to tell, and it was backed up by facts. Plote had motive. He wanted to erase Melissa and the baby. He strangled her, set the fire, and left. Her body had bruising on her throat, clear signs of manual strangulation. Her lungs had no soot, meaning she was already gone when the fire started. DNA under her fingernails proved she fought back. And then prosecutors played the tape. The 7-hour interview, the one where Plote sat stone-faced, offering clipped answers, refusing to deny what had happened, and, most importantly, his one slip-up. "I never wanted to hurt her," followed by, "So it was an accident?" Yes. That word hung in the air like a confession. But of course, the defense had its own strategy. They claim Plote was being railroaded, that the police had tunnel vision from day one, that they never seriously investigated any other possibility. They brought in John Knapp, a retired firefighter, to testify that the fire investigation was inconclusive. They suggested that Melissa's father, Gus, or a former boyfriend, should have been investigated. They argued that the fire wasn't definitively arson, that the prosecutors were stretching the facts to fit their story. And finally, they claimed that just because Plote was cold and emotionless, that didn't make him a killer. It was a desperate argument. But was it enough to create reasonable doubt? However, it took the jury just 2 hours. 2 hours to sift through 3 years of evidence, 2 weeks of testimony, 7 hours of recorded interrogation, and one cold, emotionless defendant. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. We, the jury, find the defendant, Matthew Plote, guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of intentional homicide of an unborn child, guilty of aggravated battery, guilty of arson, and guilty of concealment of a homicidal death. There was no shock on Plote's face, no panic, no pleading for mercy. But in the gallery, Melissa's family wept, because justice had been served, but it didn't feel like victory. 3 months later, on June 27, 2024, Matthew Plote stood before the judge one last time. His sentence? Life in prison. And still, he showed no emotion. For 3 years, Melissa's family had lived in the shadow of an unspeakable loss. They had waited for justice, fought for it, demanded it, and when it finally came, it felt hollow. Because justice in the end could only do one thing: punish the guilty. It could never undo the crime. It could never bring Melissa back. And it could never give Barrett the life he was supposed to have. But that didn't mean they let their grief consume them. They turned it into something greater. Instead of sinking into anger, they chose to honor Melissa and Barrett's memory in a way that would last. Her family started donating to local shelters in Barrett's name, giving struggling mothers the support that Melissa never got from Plote. Every baby item she had bought for her son, the ones he never got to use, was given to mothers in need. Because if Barrett couldn't have the life he deserved, then maybe in some way he could still help another child get theirs. But that wasn't all. Melissa had always loved the holidays, the warmth, the tradition, and there was one place she cherished most: a local arboretum where she spent countless hours beneath the trees, breathing in the quiet, finding peace in the changing seasons. So now every holiday season, a tree in that same arboretum is lit in her honor. A single glowing light in the darkness, standing tall, unshaken, just like she had always been. But even as her family created these memorials, one question still lingered, one that no one could quite answer. Could this have been prevented? Because looking back, there were signs. Melissa had told her family that Plote was unpredictable, that he was angry about the pregnancy, that he had started showing up unannounced. But no one could have imagined it would lead to this. So the real question is, how do you see danger before it's too late? Because Melissa saw the red flags, but she never thought they would kill her. And now the only thing left of her story is a lesson. A lesson about control, about obsession, about what happens when someone believes that erasing a problem is easier than facing it. Because Matthew Plote had a choice. He could have walked away. He could have accepted the truth, moved on with his life, and let Melissa live hers. But instead, he took everything from her, and in the end, he destroyed himself. Melissa and Barrett will never be forgotten, but Matthew Plote, he will never be remembered for anything else. So my dear viewers, this case leaves us with so many questions, but here are 3 we want your thoughts on. Do you think there were warning signs that Melissa's life was in danger? Could someone, her family, her friends, or even law enforcement, have stepped in earlier? Or was Plote's true nature too well hidden until it was too late? Also, if Plote hadn't been caught, do you think he would have committed another crime? Was this a one-time act of desperation? Or do you believe he was capable of doing something like this again? Then how much should a person's demeanor affect their guilt in court? Plote's lack of emotion was chilling, but should that have been a major factor in his conviction? Or do you think the evidence alone was enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're reading every single one. Let's talk about it. And while you're here, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out more true crime cases we've covered. We've got more stories just like this, ones that will make you question everything.